Not every family secret is written in blood. Some are spoken in whispers, carried across generations, and bound to a single name. The Thornes had such a secret, and every firstborn daughter bore the cost. Before we begin, tell me, where are you watching from? Drop it down in the comments. Now, lean closer, because what you're about to hear is the story of why every daughter of the Thorne line was named Mercy. The year was 1915, and the town of Ashthorne lay quiet under the late winter sky, the houses of its main street lined with clapboard siding that had weathered more than a century of New England storms. Smoke curled from chimneys in thin grey wisps, and the muffled crunch of boots on frozen earth echoed faintly in the air. At the very edge of town, beyond the crooked stone walls and the gnarled trees that still stood bare against the cold, rose the Thorne homestead. It was not the grandest house in Ashthorne, nor the oldest, but it was the one people spoke of most. Its frame was strong oak, built before the Revolution, and its roof sagged only slightly in the middle like a weary back that had carried too much history. Children dared each other to linger by its gate, where the iron latches rusted into shapes that looked too much like clutching hands. Neighbours whispered stories over laundry lines and butcher counters, as though the house itself was listening. Inside, the Thorne family was gathered. Snow light filtered through lace curtains into the parlour, where portraits stared down from gilt frames. Stern men with high collars, women with eyes that seemed too heavy for their faces. Yet what drew the eye more than the portraits were the names written beneath them. Each woman pictured, from the earliest daguerreotype to the oil paintings darkened with age, bore the same name: Mercy. On this particular February morning, the newest Mercy had just entered the world. Her cries echoed through the upstairs chamber, startling a pair of mourning doves that had perched on the frosted window ledge. Ruth Thorne, pale from her long labour, cradled the tiny bundle swaddled in wool. The midwife, a brisk woman from the north side of town, clucked her tongue and muttered prayers of thanks. "Another girl," she said, as though it were the fulfillment of something inevitable. "And so, she is Mercy." Beside the bed stood Elias Thorne, the father, his tall frame bent slightly as he stared at the infant. He was not a man given to displays of tenderness, yet something in his eyes softened as he touched the child's hand. He knew better than to argue the naming. In the Thorne family, the firstborn daughter had always been called Mercy. It was not a matter of preference, but of law, a law unwritten yet older than the house they lived in. Downstairs, the elder Mercies were waiting. The grandmother, frail but upright in her stiff chair by the fire, held a cane topped with carved bone. She had been Mercy for 74 years, and though her hair had long since whitened, her gaze was sharp, unwavering. Across from her sat Elias's sister, Mercy Ann, who at 39 had never married and had taken on the role of keeper of the house's records. She was already preparing to inscribe the new child's name into the family Bible, a book so thick with pressed flowers, handwritten notes, and faded ribbons that its spine threatened to split each time it was opened. The Bible was always brought out for such moments, not merely to record births and deaths, but to bind the family's story together. Each time a new Mercy was written down, it was as though the past pressed itself into the present with unseen weight. The grandmother's voice, thin but steady, broke the silence as she addressed her son when he descended. "Is it done?" Elias nodded. "She is named." The old woman closed her eyes briefly, as if in prayer. Then she murmured words so low Elias almost missed them. "So it continues." There was pride in her tone, but also a weariness, as though she carried a secret the younger generations did not yet understand. In town, word travelled quickly. By the next morning, the butcher's wife was telling the milliner, and the milliner told the schoolmaster, who mentioned it in class as a curious fact to children who already knew the tradition well. Each time, the statement was the same: "Another Mercy Thorne has been born." It was not surprising, but it was noteworthy, as though the town itself kept score of how many mercies walked among them. The townsfolk never asked why. Some said it was superstition. Others claimed it was gratitude for a mercy once shown long ago. A few whispered darker theories: debts owed, sins forgiven only through repetition. Yet the Thorne family themselves never spoke openly of the origin. They kept the truth within the walls of the house, and only those born to it might hear pieces of the story as they came of age. As winter thawed into early spring, the newborn Mercy grew strong. Her mother, Ruth, sang him softly as she rocked the child, while Elias busied himself with the farm, his broad shoulders bending against the plough. But there was a tension in the house, subtle at first, that seemed to deepen with each passing day. It was not merely the strain of raising a child in wartime, though Europe was already burning, and the newspapers carried grim headlines, but something older, something rooted in the very tradition that had given the child her name. At night, when the oil lamps were dimmed, Ruth sometimes woke to the sound of her daughter's cries mingled with whispers that seemed to drift through the house's timbers. She would rise, heart quickened, and find nothing but shadows cast by the moonlight. Once she carried the baby downstairs to soothe her by the fire, only to notice that the portraits seemed to flicker, their painted eyes catching the light in ways that felt too alive. The grandmother noticed as well. One evening she beckoned Elias close and pressed her brittle hand against his. "You must be watchful," she said. "The name carries more than memory. Each mercy bears the weight of the first." Elias, weary from the fields, frowned. "You speak in riddles, mother." But the old woman shook her head. "Not riddles, warnings." And so the months passed, the new mercy's presence rippling through the family like a stone dropped in still water. Each generation accepted the tradition, yet each lived with questions that gnawed at the edges of silence. For there had been a first Mercy long ago, and the truth of her story, why every Thorne daughter carried her name, was buried deep beneath layers of time, secrecy, and fear. And in 1915, as the world beyond Ashthorne trembled on the brink of upheaval, the story of the Thornes, and of the Mercies who bore the same name, was about to unfold once more. The spring of 1915 came late to Ashthorne, as if the earth itself hesitated before breaking free of winter's grip. The apple orchards on the outskirts showed only the faintest blush of green, and the fields along the river lay damp and stubborn. Yet in the Thorne household there was no mistaking the shift of season. With each new morning, the infant Mercy's cries filled the air with a strength that startled even the elders. She was a vigorous child, quick to clench her fists, quick to grasp at strands of her mother's hair, quick to demand the world's attention. Ruth, who had once feared she might never carry a child to full term, watched her daughter with reverence, almost disbelief. More than once she whispered prayers over the crib, her lips trembling as she thanked Providence for the gift of a living child. Yet in the silence after her words, she often thought of the grandmother's muttered warnings, the shadows of expectation wrapped around the name Mercy. The grandmother herself seemed more watchful than ever. Though her body weakened with the season's dampness, she insisted on being carried to the nursery each morning to see the child. She would sit upright in her chair, leaning heavily on her cane, and study the infant as though seeking out signs invisible to others. "She has the eyes," she murmured one day, more to herself than to Ruth. "What eyes?" Ruth asked, startled. The old woman did not answer directly. She only touched the baby's brow with her thin fingers and whispered, "So it begins again." Downstairs, life moved with the rhythm of necessity. Elias threw himself into the planting, his boots caked with mud, his back bent beneath sacks of seed. His sister, Mercy Ann, recorded not only the new child's entry into the family Bible, but also kept meticulous notes in a separate ledger, notes she never showed anyone, not even Elias. By candlelight, she filled page after page in her precise hand, not only of dates and names but of patterns. Illnesses that had struck, accidents that had occurred, strange occurrences tied to each firstborn Mercy across the generations. To an unknowing eye, her ledger might have appeared the private obsession of a spinster, yet to her it was a record of survival, proof that the tradition was not mere superstition but necessity. The town, meanwhile, continued its quiet watch of the Thorne family. At the general store, men spoke of Elias's diligence in the fields. At the schoolhouse, children dared each other to walk past the Thorne gate and shout, "Mercy," 3 times, as though expecting a ghost to appear. No matter how many Mercies were born, the repetition of the name never ceased to spark curiosity and unease. One evening, as the family gathered for supper, the grandmother broke a silence that had stretched for weeks. Her voice was hoarse, yet it carried the weight of command. "Elias," she said, "the time has come for you to hear the story. You are her father, and you must understand what is asked of you." The table stilled. Even the crackling of the fire seemed to hush. Elias looked from his mother's face to his wife's anxious eyes, then to the infant asleep in the cradle near the hearth. "I have heard pieces," he said cautiously, "whispers, hints, but never the whole." The grandmother tapped her cane against the floor. "You will hear it now." Mercy Ann lowered her gaze, though her hand lingered on the edge of the ledger she had left closed beside her. Ruth reached instinctively for her husband's hand, though her heart beat faster at the thought of hearing truths she had only guessed at. The old woman's voice grew steady, deliberate. "The first Mercy lived in this house before any of us, before even my grandfather was born. She was the daughter of Thomas Thorne, who built these walls with his own hands. She was named in gratitude, for she had been spared when others were not. Spared from illness, spared from fire. Her survival was considered a mercy, and so her parents believed the name would protect her." Elias leaned forward. "And did it?" The grandmother's gaze darkened. "For a time, but protection is never freely given. It was bought. A promise was made." The room grew heavy with silence, the kind that settles before a storm. Ruth could hear her own pulse in her ears. "What promise?" she whispered. The grandmother looked toward the cradle, where the infant stirred, eyes fluttering as if caught in some dream. When she spoke again, her words seemed to fall into the air like stones into deep water. "That the name would be carried, that the firstborn daughter of every generation would bear it, and that in doing so, the debt would be paid again and again, until the line was broken." Elias's jaw tightened. What debt? To whom? But the grandmother only closed her eyes, her strength suddenly spent. "Not tonight," she murmured. "You will know soon enough." Ruth rose to tend the baby, though her hands trembled as she lifted her. Mercy Ann reached for the ledger, but left it unopened, as though the words inside might be too sharp to speak aloud. Elias sat rigid, his mind churning with questions he could not yet voice. Outside, The wind rattled the shutters, carrying with it the faint scent of the sea, though the coast lay miles away. In that sound, in that restless stirring of the night air, it seemed to Ruth that something beyond the walls of the Thorne house was listening, something that had waited a long time and would wait longer still, until the truth was spoken in full. And the baby Mercy, nestled against her mother's shoulder, slept with her tiny hand clenched as though holding fast to something unseen. The summer of 1915 brought warmth and colour to Ashthorne, yet the Thorne household carried its own peculiar chill. The orchard beyond the fields bent heavy with blossoms that promised fruit, and the townsfolk busied themselves with talk of harvests and the faraway war. But within the Thorne house there was the sense of a story half-spoken, a truth still waiting in shadow. The baby Mercy grew strong and restless, her dark eyes wide with an alertness that startled Ruth at times. She laughed easily and cried fiercely, and the sound of her tiny voice carried through the rooms like a constant reminder of both joy and burden. Ruth loved her fiercely, yet each time she spoke the child's name aloud, she felt the echo of generations pressing close. The grandmother remained fixed in her determination. Each week she asked Elias to sit with her, and each week she began to unravel the story, little by little, as though the telling itself must be rationed. "It began with sickness," she said one evening, her hands folded tightly over the carved bone head of her cane. "A fever swept the town when Thomas Thorne's children were young. Many were taken, neighbours, cousins, babes still at the breast. But his daughter, his firstborn girl, did not fall ill. She survived, though the fever touched her. They called it a mercy, for no reason could be found. Others prayed to God for explanation, but Thomas's wife sought something else." Ruth leaned in, though dread prickled her skin. What did she seek? The grandmother's eyes gleamed in the firelight. She sought the help of a woman who lived beyond the town, in the woods that border the salt marsh. Some called her healer, some called her witch. She was known to deal in bargains. Mercy Ann, who had been silent until then, drew in a sharp breath. "That tale again," she murmured, though her voice trembled. The grandmother silenced her with a glance. "It is no tale. It is the truth." Thomas's wife begged for her daughter's life, begged that she be spared, and the woman agreed. But the price she set was not silver, not service, not prayer. It was promise, that the child's name would be carried, firstborn to firstborn, never broken, and that through the name, the debt would be remembered. Elias frowned, shaking his head. "And what if it is broken?" The grandmother's gaze turned heavy. "Then what was spared would be claimed, and more besides." Ruth shuddered, holding the baby closer to her chest. The fire crackled, the shadows swayed on the walls, and in the silence that followed, the baby stirred, making a soft sound as though echoing the old woman's warning. By midsummer, whispers of the Thorne family's tradition began to swell again in town. At the market, a woman with sharp eyes muttered that such repetition of a name was unnatural. At the churchyard, a man claimed he had seen one of the portraits in the Thorne house shift its expression as though it disapproved of him. None of these whispers reached the Thornes directly, but Ruth felt them nonetheless, in the looks neighbours gave her, in the way conversations halted when she entered a room. The weight of secrecy grew heavier, and with it, Ruth's unease. She began to notice patterns in the house itself, the way the floors creaked in the same places every night, the way the portraits seemed to grow darker as dusk fell, the way her daughter sometimes stared at corners where no one stood. One afternoon, unable to bear her own questions any longer, Ruth slipped into Mercian's chamber while her sister-in-law was at the garden. On the desk lay the ledger, its cover worn but carefully preserved. Ruth's hands trembled as she opened it. Inside, the pages were dense with ink. Names, dates, illnesses, accidents, uncanny events, all tied to each firstborn Mercy. One had nearly drowned in a well before being pulled out alive, coughing water but breathing still. Another had survived a carriage accident that killed 2 others, her body unscathed. Another had been lost in the woods for 3 days, only to return unharmed, claiming she had been led back by a kind woman with dark eyes. Each account was precise, clinical even, but beneath the ink Ruth felt the thrum of fear. The pattern was unmistakable. Every firstborn Mercy survived what others did not, and every survival seemed tinged with the unnatural. The final page she turned to was unfinished. It bore only a heading, Mercy, 1915. Beneath it, Mercy and had written in her careful hand, born February 18th. Strong, alert, to be watched. Ruth closed the book sharply, her breath ragged. She felt as though she had trespassed into a chamber not meant for her, yet the knowledge burned within her now. She could not look at her daughter without wondering whose unseen hand had secured her survival, and what price was still being exacted. That night, Ruth confronted her husband in whispers after the house had fallen silent. "Elias," she said, gripping his arm, "your sister keeps records of every Mercy. She knows more than she tells. Your mother speaks of bargains. How long will you let this remain hidden from me?" Elias, weary from the fields, looked at her with anguish. "Do you think I do not wonder the same? But what can I do? To break the name is to risk the debt. To keep it is to live in shadow. We are caught in something older than both of us." Their words fell into the stillness of the room, and for a moment neither spoke again. Then the baby stirred, her cry piercing the silence, and Ruth rose to soothe her. As she held her, the child's tiny fingers curled around her own with surprising strength, and for the first time, Ruth wondered if her daughter understood far more than she should. And outside the window, where the orchard met the dark line of the woods, an owl hooted once, then fell silent, as if bearing witness. By autumn of 1915, the leaves of Ashthorne blazed with colour, the hills wrapped in red and gold as though the land itself burned with quiet fire. The harvest was leaner than Elias Thorne had hoped, yet enough to keep the family through winter. In town, war headlines still filled the papers, and talk of enlistment drifted through the taverns. But in the Thorne household, concern for the outside world felt distant compared to the weight of the family's own history. The baby Mercy had grown into a sturdy child, her dark hair curling at her temples, her eyes large and unblinking. Strangers often commented on her gaze, saying she looked far older than her months. Ruth smiled politely when they said so, though in private she prayed over the child, whispering words of protection. The grandmother's health faltered as the nights grew longer. She seldom rose from her chair now, and her voice, once sharp, trembled with weakness. Yet when she spoke, her words cut deep. "Elias," she said one evening, her hand clutching his sleeve with surprising strength, "you must be ready. The debt does not rest only with the child. The whole family bears its weight." Elias knelt beside her. "Tell me plainly, mother, what do we owe? What have we been spared?" Her breath rattled, and for a moment Ruth feared the answer would be lost. But the old woman's eyes burned with sudden clarity. It was not only illness that spared the first Mercy. It was fire. The house once burned, when she was but a girl. Flames licked the beams, smoke choked the air. Neighbors thought all would perish. But she was found outside, unscathed, though no one saw her leave. And in the ashes, her mother spoke of a figure, a woman standing among the flames, untouched. A woman who took nothing then, because the promise had been made. Silence stretched through the room, the fire snapping low in the hearth. Ruth felt her skin prickle. And this woman, she was the same one who bargained for the child's life? The grandmother nodded faintly. She has been seen more than once. Some call her spirit, some call her curse. But she is bound to us, as we are bound to her. Elias clenched his fists, his jaw set. And what will she ask of our mercy? The grandmother's gaze shifted to the cradle. She already has. The name is the tether. The girl will carry it, as all before her have. That is the price. The baby stirred then, as though aware of being spoken of. Her small cry broke the silence, and Ruth lifted her, heart trembling. She wanted to demand more, to demand clarity, but the grandmother's strength had ebbed. The old woman leaned back in her chair, her eyes closing, and no further words came. In the weeks that followed, Ruth's unease grew. She began to dream of fire, flames racing through the halls, smoke billowing against the windows, and always, the figure of a woman at the threshold. Sometimes the woman was veiled in shadow, sometimes clear as day, her eyes dark and unblinking. Each time Ruth woke gasping, clutching the child close, as though afraid someone might claim her before morning. Mercy and grew restless as well. Ruth often found her sitting by the window with the ledger open, staring not at the words but at the woods beyond the orchard. Once, Ruth asked her what she sought. Mercy Ann's answer was quiet, almost too quiet to hear. "I look for her," she said. The first frost came early that year, and with it an unsettling stillness. The nights seemed longer, the house heavier with silence. On All Hallows' Eve, when the town children lit jack-o'-lanterns and ran laughing through the streets, the Thorne house stood dark, its shutters closed. Within, the family gathered in uneasy vigil. It was then that Ruth heard it, a knock at the door, soft but deliberate, though no visitor was expected. Elias rose, his face pale, and went to answer. When he opened the door, no one stood there. Only the cold wind swept in, carrying the faint scent of smoke. The grandmother stirred in her chair, whispering words too faint to catch. Mercy, and crossed herself. Ruth held the baby close, whispering her daughter's name as though the repetition itself were protection. That night, no one slept, and by morning, the grandmother's chair stood empty. She had passed in the night, her hand still clutching her cane, her lips parted as though mid-warning. The family buried her in the thorn plot beside the other Mercies, the name etched yet again into stone. The townsfolk gathered, offering condolences, but more than one whispered that the house seemed heavier now, as though a gatekeeper had been lost. Ruth felt the truth of it. With the grandmother gone, the family was left to face the story on their own, and the presence that waited in the woods, in the fire, in the very name they carried. That night, after the mourners had gone and the house lay quiet, Ruth rose from bed, carrying the baby in her arms. She went to the window that looked out over the orchard and the dark fringe of trees beyond. The moon hung low, silvering the branches, and there, at the edge of the woods, she thought she saw a figure, a woman standing still among the trees, her form shadowed yet undeniable. Ruth clutched her child tighter. For the first time, she spoke not a prayer, but a plea. Leave her be. The figure did not move. The wind stirred the branches, carrying the scent of smoke once more. Then, as suddenly as she had seen her, the figure was gone. But Ruth knew she had been there, and she would return. Winter descended heavy over Ashthorne in the final weeks of 1915. Snow piled against the stone walls and drifted across the fields, burying the last of the harvest stubble until the land seemed swallowed in white silence. The town huddled against the cold, families drawing closer to hearths, their windows glowing faintly in the long nights. In the Thorne house, the fire never went out. Ruth fed it through the small hours, afraid of the dark and what might move within it. Elias kept to his work, chopping wood until his arms ached, hauling it inside as though quantity alone might ward off what lingered at the edge of their lives. Mercy and grew more withdrawn, her ledger never far from her hand. And the baby, the newest Mercy, thrived, her small laughter ringing sharp against the hush of snow. Yet the shadow of the grandmother's death weighed on them all. The house felt less guarded, less tethered, as though her absence had left a door ajar. At night Ruth swore she heard whispers in the walls, not the creaks of wood or settling frost, but voices low and urgent, their words impossible to catch. One evening, Elias came in from the woodpile with his face pale beneath the frost. There were tracks, he said, pulling off his boots, in the snow by the orchard. Not animal, not human either. Too long between steps, too deep. Mercy and looked up sharply, toward the house. He nodded once. They searched the yard by lantern light, but the snow had filled them before morning. Still, Ruth could not shake the image, something walking in silence, leaving marks too wide for any neighbor, too deliberate for any wandering deer. On Christmas Eve, the family gathered in uneasy ceremony. Ruth dressed the baby in white. Elias read aloud from the Bible, Mercy, and sang a hymn in a trembling voice. Yet the words felt brittle, fragile against the cold pressing in from the windows. When the last note faded, the silence returned like a weight. That night, Ruth dreamed again of fire. She saw the house engulfed, flames licking the walls, the portraits above the hearth curling and blackening. And standing in the doorway was the figure of the woman, tall, dark-eyed, her expression unreadable. In her dream, Ruth tried to flee with the baby, but her feet would not move. The woman reached out her hand, and the child leaned toward it willingly, as though she knew her. Ruth woke with a cry, clutching her daughter, the sheets damp with sweat. Elias stirred beside her, but before she could speak, a sound broke the night, a knock, soft but deliberate, just as it had come on the night of the grandmother's death. This time, Elias did not rise. He lay rigid, staring at the ceiling, his jaw clenched. Ruth held the baby against her chest, rocking gently, whispering her name again and again. The knock came a second time, louder now. Then silence. Morning revealed nothing. The snow outside lay smooth, unbroken, no tracks leading to the door. But Ruth knew the sound had not been dream. Through the rest of winter, Elias grew restless, working longer hours in the cold, his face lined with weariness. Ruth feared he carried more than he admitted. When she pressed him, he shook his head. "We must endure," was all he said. Mercy and meanwhile began adding new pages to her ledger. Ruth caught glimpses of them, her careful hand writing not only the child's growth but the knocks, the tracks, the dreams. She recorded them as though they were facts, inevitable as the turning of the seasons. By February, the baby Mercy had reached her first year. Ruth baked a small cake, though her heart was heavy. Neighbors came with gifts, remarking on the child's bright eyes and sturdy steps. Yet behind their smiles, Ruth sensed unease. They knew, as all Ashthorne knew, what it meant for the firstborn Thorne girl to be called Mercy. That evening, after the neighbors had gone and the house had quieted, Ruth sat alone by the fire with her daughter asleep in her arms. She thought of the grandmother's words, of debts and promises, of names carried like chains, and she whispered into the silence, not knowing if she spoke to God or to the shadow that haunted her dreams. If it must be born, let it fall on me. Spare her. The flames flickered sharply, as though answering. For a moment Ruth thought she smelled smoke stronger than the fire before her, acrid, wild, like burning wood carried on the wind. She closed her eyes, heart pounding, and held the child tighter. When she opened them again, the fire burned steady. The room was empty, but deep inside, Ruth knew her words had been heard, and far out beyond the orchard, where the trees met the frozen marsh, a figure stood briefly in the snow, watching the house. The thaw of 1916 came slow and heavy, the river swollen with meltwater, the fields muddy and reluctant to green. In Ashthorne, townsfolk spoke of Europe's war with more urgency now, for names of young men from the county began to appear in the casualty lists. But within the Thorne house, the war beyond the ocean felt no closer than the stars. Their battles were older, older than even memory, bound not to nations but to a name. The baby Mercy was no longer a baby. She had begun to walk, her steps unsteady but determined, her small hands grasping at table legs and skirts. Ruth watched her with pride, but also with unease. The child's eyes followed things unseen. More than once Ruth found her daughter standing at the window, hand pressed to the glass, staring into the orchard with a seriousness too great for her years. One afternoon in early spring, Ruth found her daughter in the parlor, pointing at one of the portraits. The girl's lips moved as though she were speaking, though no sound came. When Ruth called her name, Mercy turned, smiling brightly, as though nothing were amiss. But Ruth could not forget the look on her face, not the smile, but the stillness that had come before. Mercy, and noticed as well. Her ledger grew thick with notes, recording not only the child's growth but strange incidents. Doors opening on their own, a lullaby hummed in the nursery when no one stood inside, the scent of smoke drifting through closed windows. Elias dismissed such things when Ruth tried to speak of them. "You're tired," he would say, rubbing her shoulders with his work-worn hands. "The winter has been long." Shadows play tricks on weary eyes. Yet his own sleep grew restless. Ruth would wake to find him sitting upright in bed, staring into the dark, his jaw tight, as though he too heard what he would not admit. By midsummer, the orchard bore fruit heavy and early. The townsfolk remarked on the bounty, though Elias swore he had done nothing differently. Ruth thought of the old stories, of bargains struck, of mercies given and owed. She did not eat the first apples, leaving them in the cellar, untouched. That season brought something else as well. On a still night in July, Ruth heard again the knock at the door. This time it came not once or twice, but 3 times in steady rhythm. Elias rose with sudden fury, seizing the lantern and flinging the door open. The yard was empty, the orchard still beneath the moon. Yet the lantern's flame flickered violently, though no wind blew. Elias stepped into the night, his breath sharp in the silence. Ruth stood in the doorway, clutching her daughter, whispering her name like a prayer. When Elias returned, his face was pale, his hands trembling. He set the lantern down without a word and sat heavily by the fire. Ruth asked him what he had seen, but he only shook his head. The next morning, she found his boots by the door. Their soles were scorched, blackened as though he had walked through cinders. After that night, Elias kept his silence. He worked the fields harder, spoke less, and came home with his eyes shadowed. Ruth feared the truth of what he had seen, for if he would not say it, it must have been worse than she could bear. Autumn came again, the air sharp with smoke from the neighbors' fields, the sky low and grey. One evening, Ruth returned from the garden to find her daughter gone from the parlour. Panic seized her, and she called for Elias and Mercy Ann. They searched the rooms, the yard, the orchard. They found the child at the edge of the woods. She stood still, her small figure framed by the dark trees, one hand lifted as though reaching for something. Ruth ran to her, scooping her up, her voice breaking with relief. "What were you doing, my darling? What were you reaching for?" The child only looked at her, eyes wide, and said in her clear young voice, "The lady was calling." Ruth's heart froze. She carried the child back to the house, clutching her as though she could never let go. Elias shut the shutters tight, his face grim, while Mercy turned a page in her ledger with trembling hands. That night, when the house had quieted, Ruth went again to the window. The orchard stretched pale in the moonlight, the woods beyond dark and watchful. And though she told herself it was only fear, only imagination, she thought she saw the figure there again, tall, unmoving, waiting. The child slept soundly, her breath steady, her small hand curled against her mother's chest. But Ruth could not sleep, for she knew the truth now beyond denial. The debt was not only past, it lived still, reaching, calling, and her daughter, bright and unknowing, had already begun to hear. The year turned to 1917, and though snow blanketed Ashthorne once more, Ruth felt less shielded by the quiet than trapped inside it. The war in Europe thundered in headlines, and young men marched away with promises to return. But in the Thorne house, another march continued unseen, a march of names, of debts, of shadow. Mercy, 2 years old now, had grown lively and quick, darting about the rooms with a laugh that could brighten even Elias's tired face. Yet there was something about her laughter, too sudden, too knowing, that unsettled Ruth. Sometimes the girl laughed when no one spoke, her eyes fixed on the corners of the room. "Who are you looking at, my darling?" Ruth asked once, crouching beside her. Mercy smiled. "The lady." The words fell into Ruth's chest like stones. She pressed the child close, whispering, "There is no lady." But the girl only giggled, wriggling free, her small feet pattering across the floorboards. Elias, though silent of late, carried the same dread. Ruth often found him outside at night, lantern in hand, staring toward the orchard as though waiting. His boots left paths in the snow leading back and forth, worn trails that ended at the edge of the trees. When she asked what he sought, he shook his head. "Nothing," he said, "only to be certain." Yet his eyes told otherwise. Mercy, and meanwhile, grew more severe. The ledger consumed her. Her notes spread beyond its covers into loose scraps she tucked between pages. Ruth glimpsed phrases when she passed. Lady by the woods. Knocks at the door. Scorched prints. It was as though Mercy and sought to capture the pattern, to pin it like an insect on the page. One stormy night, Ruth woke to find the child's crib empty. Panic clawed her throat. She called out, and Elias rushed from bed. They searched the house, the parlor, the kitchen. Nothing. At last they found the child standing at the front door, her hand on the latch. "What are you doing, Mercy?" Elias demanded, lifting her into his arms. The girl blinked sleepily. "She said I should come out. She said it was time." Ruth clutched her daughter, heart hammering. Elias barred the door with iron, his face white. Mercy wrote furiously by candlelight, the nib of her pen scratching deep into the paper. The next day, Ruth insisted on taking the child into town, hoping the bustle would drown the whispers in their house. Yet even in town, unease followed. The schoolmaster paused in his steps when he saw the girl, remarking how much she resembled the portraits in the Thorne house. The butcher's wife crossed herself openly as Ruth passed. That evening, Ruth walked home with the child in her arms, the church bell tolling in the distance. She could not shake the feeling of eyes upon her, watching from the trees, from the fields, from the sky itself. Winter pressed on. The family endured, clinging to routine as though it might anchor them. But the knock returned. Not once, not twice, but again and again, sometimes 3 nights in a row. Always the same, soft, deliberate, without tracks in the snow to explain it. One night, Elias swore he would answer it. He flung open the door, lantern raised high, and strode into the yard. Ruth stood frozen, Mercy in her arms. She heard his voice call into the dark, harsh and demanding. Then silence. When Elias returned, his face was ashen. He set the lantern down with a trembling hand. "She is real," he whispered. Ruth felt her blood turn to ice. "You saw her." He nodded once, unable to meet her eyes. "She waits at the edge of the orchard. Not ghost, not dream. Flesh and shadow both. And she watches for our Mercy." The room fell silent, save for the fire's crackle. Mercy stirred in Ruth's arms, her small voice soft as sleep. "She said my name." Ruth nearly dropped her. She pressed her daughter close, rocking her with desperate force. Elias turned away, his shoulders bowed, while Mercian's pen scratched furiously into her ledger, as though the act of writing could keep terror at bay. That night, none of them slept. Ruth lay awake with her daughter against her chest, whispering prayers until her throat ached. Elias sat by the fire with his axe across his knees. Mercy wrote by candlelight until the flames sputtered and died. And in the orchard, under the cold sweep of the moon, a figure stood waiting, patient, watchful, bound by a promise older than them all. Spring of 1918 crept into Ashthorne with a strange quiet, the thaw marked not by bird calls but by silences between them. The war across the ocean had grown louder in the papers, but in town another worry rose. Influenza whispered from port cities, spreading like shadow. Ashthorne waited, uneasy, for sickness to find its way north. In the Thorne house, Ruth feared 2 hungers, the one that took men by fever and the one that waited at the orchard's edge. Mercy, now 3 years old, was nimble on her feet, her curls bouncing as she ran through the halls. Yet her games unsettled Ruth. She played with no toys, no dolls, but with the air itself, her hands cupped as though holding invisible fingers. "Who is it you play with, my darling?" Ruth asked once, her voice careful. Mercy beamed. "The lady. She says I mustn't be afraid." The words chilled Ruth. She forbade her daughter to play alone, keeping her close at all times. But still, she would catch the girl staring at the window, lips moving in unheard conversation. Elias grew hollow with worry. He carried the axe with him even in daylight, leaving it propped against the hearth as though expecting the knock to come at any moment. His eyes reddened with lack of sleep, his face drawn. Mercy, and more gaunt than ever, filled her ledger with frantic detail. She began to cross-reference accounts from town records, noting other families who had lost firstborn daughters to fever or fire, always when no Mercy Thorne was taken. She muttered as she wrote, "It moves from house to house, but it never takes ours." By midsummer, influenza had reached neighbouring towns. Ashthorne braced, shuttering homes, closing church doors. Fear thickened the air. Ruth prayed the fever would pass them by, but she knew too well the price such mercies demanded. And when the sickness struck Ashthorne, it came like a storm. Children fell first, their cries turning to silence within days. Men staggered in fields, women collapsed at wash basins. The churchyard filled too quickly, graves dug by trembling hands. In the Thorne house, the fever brushed past but did not linger. Elias coughed for a week, but rose again. Ruth grew pale and weak, but the illness did not claim her. Mercy tended them with a grim steadiness, though her eyes flicked often to the woods. And little Mercy, bright and laughing, never so much as flushed with heat. The neighbours whispered. Some called it blessing, others curse. A mother who had buried her child spat in Ruth's direction outside the market. "Your mercies live while ours die," she hissed. "What bargain did you strike?" Ruth carried the words home, the sting sharp in her chest. She wanted to say it was no bargain of hers, no choice of hers, but her throat tightened with silence. One night, as the fever raged in town, the knock came again. Soft, deliberate. Elias leapt to his feet, axe in hand, but Ruth caught his arm. "Don't," she whispered. The knock came again, and then a voice. A woman's voice, low and clear, drifting through the door as though it seeped from the wood itself. "Mercy!" The child stirred from sleep, lifting her head. "She's calling me," she said brightly. Ruth held her tight, tears burning her eyes. "No, my darling, not tonight." The voice came again, softer. "Mercy!" Elias raised the axe, his hand trembling. But when he flung the door wide, the yard lay empty, the orchard still beneath the moon. Only the faint scent of smoke lingered, curling into the night. The fever in town waned by autumn, but the graveyard had doubled in size. The Thornes had not buried their child. Neighbours avoided them now, crossing the street, their whispers sharp as knives. Ruth felt the weight of every look, every silence. She carried her daughter close, as though the town itself might try to claim her. And yet, in the stillness of night, Ruth wondered if the town's hatred mattered at all. For the debt was not to them. It was to the woman in the orchard, the figure who waited still. And each time Mercy laughed into empty air, Each time she spoke to unseen company, Ruth feared the promise was drawing nearer to its due. The winter of 1919 fell harsh upon Ashthorne, the snow pressing heavy against roofs, the river crusted thick with ice. Townsfolk still carried the grief of influenza, too many graves dug, too many chairs left empty at tables. But the Thornes carried a different weight, heavier and more private. Mercy, nearly 4 now, had grown tall for her age, her gaze sharper than ever. Ruth often caught her child studying the portraits with a seriousness no child should bear. Sometimes she would point at a face and ask, "What happened to her?" as though she already knew there was always a story beneath the painted eyes. One evening, while Ruth mended by the fire, she heard her daughter's voice from the hallway. Ruth rose quietly, listening. The girl was speaking in hushed tones, her words spaced as though in reply. "Yes," Mercy said. Pause. "I will." Pause again. "Not yet. But soon." Ruth's blood ran cold. She rushed into the hall, calling her daughter's name. Mercy turned, smiling innocently. "I was talking to the lady." Ruth fell to her knees, gripping her child by the shoulders. "What does she say to you, Mercy?" The girl tilted her head, her dark curls falling into her eyes. "She says I am hers." Ruth held her so tightly the child whimpered. Elias grew more haunted as the year pressed on. He seldom spoke, his shoulders stooped as though the very beams of the house pressed down on him. At night Ruth heard him pacing, the floor creaking under his heavy steps. Sometimes he stopped outside the nursery, his breathing ragged, as though he stood guard against something he could neither see nor fight. Mercy Ann's ledger grew frantic. The once neat lines turned hurried, the ink smudged. Ruth caught glimpses, dreams of fire. "Lady at the door. The child speaks with her daily." She wrote as though writing alone might hold the story in place, keep it from consuming them. In January, on the night of a full moon, the knock came again. Not soft this time, but firm, as though claiming right of entry. Elias barred the door with timber, sweat shining on his brow. Ruth clutched her daughter close, whispering prayers. Mercy Ann read aloud from Scripture until her voice cracked. And then, silence. The knock ceased. The night stretched long, brittle with waiting. When dawn came, Elias stepped outside, axe in hand. The snow lay undisturbed, save for one thing. At the edge of the orchard stood a circle of blackened ground, as though fire had burned there in the night and gone out without leaving smoke. Elias said nothing when he returned. He only set his axe by the hearth and sat down heavily, his eyes hollow. By March, whispers in town grew louder. A neighbour's boy claimed he had seen a woman by the thorn orchard at dusk, her figure tall and still. Another swore she had passed the house and smelled smoke though no chimney burned. Rumours spread of curses, of bargains, of the price the Thornes had paid. At church one Sunday, the minister's sermon lingered long on the subject of debts passed through generations, sins carried by the bloodline. Ruth sat rigid in the pew, her child beside her, feeling every word aimed like an arrow. That night she dreamed again of fire. The house burned, flames curling the rafters, smoke clawing her throat. The woman stood at the nursery door, her eyes fixed on the child's bed. In the dream Ruth screamed, lunging to protect her daughter, but her arms would not move. The woman reached down, lifting the girl gently, almost tenderly, and spoke one word that rang through the smoke. Mine." Ruth woke sobbing, clutching her daughter. Elias sat beside her, his face drawn, his hand heavy on her shoulder. He said nothing, but his silence carried more dread than any word. By summer, Mercy's laughter had grown strange, not childish delight, but something older, deeper, that chilled Ruth even as it rang sweet. One afternoon, Ruth found her daughter seated in the orchard, hands folded in her lap, speaking softly to the air. "What are you saying, my love?" Ruth asked, kneeling. Mercy looked up, her eyes dark and steady. "She says the time is soon. She says the promise cannot be broken." Ruth's heart stopped. She gathered her daughter, carrying her inside, her steps unsteady. Elias met her at the door, his face grim. "What did she say?" he asked, though he already knew. Ruth's voice broke as she answered, "That the promise will be kept." The house fell silent, the weight of generations pressing down. And out in the orchard, where the branches swayed against the sky, a figure stood once more, patient and unyielding, waiting. The year turned to 1920, and the Thornes carried themselves as though each day might be the last their Mercy would draw breath beneath their roof. The orchard loomed larger than ever, its branches stark against the winter sky. Ashthorne whispered of them openly now, of bargains older than memory, of daughters bound by name and unseen hand. Mercy was 5. She laughed, she sang, she traced her fingers across frost on the windowpane. She was light itself in the house, and yet Ruth feared that light was already claimed. The girl's eyes held something watchful, knowing, as though she bore memories not her own. One January night, the knock returned, 3 times, measured and resolute. Elias rose with his axe, but Mercy and caught his arm. "Steel will not bar her," she whispered. Her face was gaunt, her eyes hollow from sleepless nights. This was never ours to fight. But Elias tore free, flinging the door open with fury. The figure stood clear this time, no longer a shadow glimpsed at distance, but a woman formed sharp against the snow. Tall, clad in black that shimmered like smoke, her face pale, her eyes dark as the orchard's depths. She did not move. She only lifted one hand and beckoned. "Mercy," she said. The word carried not as sound but as truth, vibrating through the beams of the house, through the marrow of their bones. Ruth clutched her daughter to her chest, whispering her name like a shield. "You cannot have her," she gasped. "Not my child. Not my Mercy." But the girl stirred, her voice soft and certain. "Mama, I must." Elias staggered back, the axe slipping from his grasp. His knees buckled, his breath shuddering. Mercy wrote still, her pen scratching furiously into the ledger, as though recording the moment might anchor the child in ink. Tears streaked her cheeks, her lips moving in silent prayer. Ruth fell to her knees, clutching her daughter. "Why?" she cried into the night, her voice breaking. "Why must it be so?" The woman's gaze did not waver. A promise made, a promise kept, blood for blood, name for name. The orchard rustled though no wind blew. The very earth seemed to shift beneath their feet. Ruth held her daughter tighter, her heart breaking, but Mercy slipped free of her arms, stepping toward the door with a strange calm. She turned back once, smiling, not with fear, but with a serenity that broke her mother's soul. "It's all right, Mama. She says I was always hers." Ruth screamed, rushing forward, But Elias caught her, his arms iron despite his tears. "If you take her back, the debt will only claim another," he rasped. "It has always been so. It will always be so." The woman extended her hand. The child placed her small fingers within it, and together they stepped into the night. The door swung shut without a touch. Silence fell heavy in the house. Ruth collapsed to the floor, her sobs racking the stillness. Elias bowed his head, his shoulders shaking. Mercy Ann's pen clattered from her fingers, the ink blotting the final page of her ledger. Morning came grey and cold. The crib lay empty, the orchard bare. Neighbours whispered that the Thornes had finally paid their price. Some called it curse, some called it justice. None dared speak the truth aloud, that the promise endured, and it would rise again. For in the Thorne house the portraits remained, dozens of Mercies, their painted eyes watching from the walls. And the ledger lay open still, the ink drying on the last line Mercy and had written, "The debt is never ended. It is only renewed." And as the years rolled forward, the town of Ashthorne waited, for they knew the name would be given again. And when it was, the orchard's shadow would lengthen, and the woman would come once more. For every firstborn daughter of the Thorne line would bear the name Mercy, and every Mercy would one day be called. The orchard grows silent now, but silence does not mean the end. Promises wait, names endure, and somewhere another Mercy will one day be called. If you would linger in the dark where such stories breathe, follow the shadows with eternal Obsidian.